Good evening, and welcome to the 23rd Mona and Otto Weinmann Annual Lecture, organized by the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies here at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. My name is Leah Wolfson, and I am the Senior Program Officer at the Mandel Center's University Programs Division. The Mandel Center serves as the preeminent interdisciplinary center for Holocaust studies in the United States and around the globe. We sponsor numerous research and faculty training seminars, the largest residency fellowship program for junior and senior scholars, as well as opportunities for students at colleges and universities across North America and around the world. While we organize and facilitate more programs than I have time to enumerate here, I hope you will take advantage of the materials outside the auditorium and the foyer which describe these activities in more detail. Before turning to our main event tonight, Professor Devin Naar's lecture, I would like to cover a few logistical details. First, please take a moment to silence your cell phones and any other devices that might distract from our speaker this evening. The Mona and Otto Weinmann Annual Lecture is one of the Mandel Center's outstanding programs, and I would like to begin this evening with some special words of appreciation for Janice Weinmann-Shorenstein and her family. Janice Weinmann-Shorenstein endowed this lecture in 1995 as a tribute to her parents, Mona and Otto Weinmann, and to all Holocaust survivors, to whom we owe a special debt of gratitude for telling their stories and inspiring the creation of this institution. Their voices still ring strong, and it is our duty to them to ensure that they will be heard for generations to come. It was Janice's early commitment to survivors and scholarship that enabled us to invite the world's leading scholars, some of whom were themselves witnesses to Nazi terror, to share their research on and perspective of the survivor experience. We are here today, as ever, indebted by their voices, and I welcome those in the audience with us this evening. Tonight, I would also like to acknowledge the presence of Shin DC, or Sephardic Heritage International, here with us tonight, and specifically acknowledge their founding director, Franz Ephraim Katzir. We are delighted to have Janice Weinmann-Shorenstein and her husband, Stuart Shorenstein, with us tonight, and it is now my pleasure to invite Janice to the podium to say a few words. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. A current book entitled A Time Not Long Ago, A Place Not Far Away, refers to Auschwitz. To me, it describes the entire Holocaust. I recently had the privilege of attending the 25th anniversary of Schindler's List. The movie was even more compelling and moving than when I first saw it a quarter of a century ago. Then the Holocaust was still fresh in the minds of Americans. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum was opening. The story of Israel was still considered a miracle, and American Jews were largely united in their support of the Jewish state and its values, ideals, and survival. Times are different now, and we see Holocaust deniers popping up into our political discourse and a world that has forgotten the tragedy of the Holocaust and which has repeatedly engaged in genocides, even in its aftermath. After the movie, there was a panel which included Steven Spielberg, Liam Neeson, and Sir Ben Kingsley. The overriding sentiment that resonated from them was the continued need to remind, revisit, and reinforce the memory of the overwhelming tragedy, particularly because the lessons that it provides at a time when we are experiencing such discord among individuals and groups in this country. Today, the expressions of divisiveness and even hatred have reached record highs in America, with little expressions of guilt or remorse and insufficient recognition of those victimized. The increase in hate crimes, the socialization of white nationalism in politics around the globe, and the scapegoating of Jews and other minorities has no longer spoken of in whispers, but loudly as movements in political campaigns. What we have endured throughout the centuries we thought had culminated in the Holocaust. But that may not be the case, and that is why this institution is so vital to remember what did happen, and to give voice to all of those whose voices were silenced. As I was leaving the theater, I bumped into an old friend who expressed similar feelings of despair that despite the reminders that we share, this generation sees the Holocaust as a phenomenon rather than as a recurring example of and that the next generation will have no connection to this genocide at all. I informed him how grateful I felt that the organization that I head, Hadassah, is carrying a legislative bill introduced by Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney to provide Holocaust education in schools throughout the country. He remarked how lucky I am to have the opportunity to expose the youth of America to this information. The Never Again Education Act establishes a program at the U.S. Department of Education to help middle and high school schools educate their students about the Holocaust. It establishes a federal fund at the department which will be paid for by private donations to cover the expenses for training of educators, providing appropriate textbooks, transportation and housing for teachers to attend seminars, as well as giving funding directly to teachers to develop individualized programs that best suit their students' needs. On May 17th, over 200 Hadassah women from around the country visited members of Congress in the Senate and the House to promote adoption of the bill. The unanimous endorsements that we received were accompanied by consistent expressions not only of support, but also of conviction that educating children was a necessity in order to have them appreciate the historical narrative and to understand the broader intergroup dynamics we face again today. A time not long ago, a place not far away. The Holocaust was built on a foundation of hate and loathing, created by crude generalizations and reductive slogans targeting ethnic groups, political opponents, social outsiders, and other deviants. Today, we see a 40% increase in hate crimes overall in the United States towards such groups as Muslims, Jews, and immigrants. And from 2016 to 2017, a 60% rise in hate crimes specifically against Jews, the largest single-year increase on record and the second highest number reported since the ADL started tracking incident data in the 1970s. Every part of the country was affected, with an incident reported in all 50 states for the first time in a decade. When we consider the Holocaust, the key catastrophe of the 20th century, the great majority of people understand it as a single historical disaster. I suggest that it is part of a continuum that is universal, that ebbs and flows throughout the world and time, stimulated and encouraged by the moral environment in which we live, the level of tolerance we exhibit, and the amount of permission we give to acts of human violation and destruction. As this lecture is endowed in perpetuity, so must the memories and the lessons of the Holocaust be continued, emphasized, and ingrained. America is the greatest society to set an example and to instill a sense of responsibility amongst its citizens, a commitment to stop the defamation of people and to secure justice and fair treatment for all. While a bill to educate children throughout our country is only one route to to raising consciousness and establishing a sense of responsibility, it is a critical and necessary tactic to perpetuate understanding of and tolerance for all individuals. It builds upon and supplements the important work of this institution in ensuring that the next generation is not indifferent and it's committed to the civility of all. As always and evermore, I am grateful to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum for its support of this series and for the invaluable and unparalleled work that it does. I'm also grateful to our speaker for bringing us tonight a different perspective on the circumstances of World War II as he describes the fate of the Sephardic community during this time. Since 1982, my husband, daughter, and I have been living across the street from the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue in New York, the first congregation to be founded in the United States in the 1660s. The institution and its community took us in during periods of grief and celebration of joy, from the daily minions of saying Kaddish to the birth of our grandson. So we are particularly and personally grateful that this year's program will put a spotlight on the experience of the Sephardi community, which was uprooted from its homelands during the Holocaust and which suffered its own form of persecution during this time. Thank you so much for joining us. And to all of you, our sincerest appreciation for being part of this evening. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Janice, for those moving words. It is now my honor to welcome Dr. Devin Naar. Dr. Naar is the Isaac Aldhev Professor in Sephardic Studies, Associate Professor of History, and faculty at the Strom Center for Jewish Studies in the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. Dr. Naar received his PhD in history at Stanford University. He has also served as a Fulbright Fellow to Greece. His first book, Jewish Salonica, Between the Ottoman Empire and Modern Greece, was published by Stanford University Press in 2016 and won the National Jewish Book Award in the category of research based on archival material during that year. It also won the 2017 Edmund Keeley Prize for Best Book in Modern Greek Studies, awarded by the Modern Greek Studies Association. This book will be for sale in the foyer after Devin Naar's lecture this evening. As the chair of the new Sephardic Studies program of the Strom Center for Jewish Studies, housed within the Jackson School of International Studies, Dr. Naar has spearheaded a project to collect, preserve, and disseminate the rich Sephardic and Ladino historical, literary, and cultural heritage. Tonight, Dr. Naar will deliver his lecture entitled Far From Us, But Close at Heart, Sephardic Jews in America Confront the Holocaust. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Naar.
Kalispera σας. Que vengas enhorabuena. Buonasera. Thank you for being here, and thank you, Leah, for the introduction, and many thanks to all of those here at the Holocaust Museum who have been involved in making tonight's evening possible, and a special thanks to the Weinmann Shorenstein family for your generosity and for making tonight possible as well. I'd like to begin with an observation about Sephardic culture. And one of the aspects of Sephardic culture is there's a genre of story known as the conseja, which is what is called in Ladino. And the conseja is a kind of story that's told to entertain and also to educate. These stories tend to be anonymous, but I'm going to share more of a personal one. As a college student, I attended a community-wide Holocaust commemoration. Before the program began, I was chatting with some of the other attendees. An elderly woman inquired what my connection was to the commemoration, and I explained that my grandfather's oldest brother, Salomon, who's pictured here, his wife Esther, and their 2 children, Benjamin and Rachel, were murdered in Auschwitz. She asked, well, where were they from? I said, Salonica, in Greece. She processed what I said for a moment, and she replied, well, that can't be. I was a prisoner in Auschwitz, and I never met a Jew from Greece. I was really shocked by that encounter, which I consider still till this day a kind of, not intentional, but nonetheless effective kind of Holocaust denial of sorts. A denial that Jews from Greece had experienced the Holocaust. The response from this survivor revealed that she had never encountered, she had never had to think about the full scope of the Holocaust in terms of geography and in terms of cultural impact. Not only was Yiddish decimated, of course, but so too was Ladino. I realized that in academic circles, in the popular imagination, in public commemoration, including here at the Holocaust Museum, although it's changing, the experiences of Sephardi Jews tend to be relegated to the margins of the story or written out altogether. And here we can see a plaque that was unveiled at Auschwitz in Ladino, in the Judeo-Spanish language of the Sephardic Jews in 2003, which was over 40 years after 19 plaques in other languages had been revealed, and it was only permitted after the advocacy and lobbying of some Ladino-speaking survivors of Auschwitz. Now, why? Why this invisibility? We can pinpoint a number of reasons. We might say demographics, for example. Sephardi Jews constituted a few 100,000 compared to the millions of Ashkenazi Jews who experienced the Holocaust. But I'd like to suggest that the issue is not only one of numbers, it's also an issue that relates to conceptual, methodological, and political concerns. Sephardi Jews as a discrete community don't easily fit onto our map, a map which is organized according to nation states. That's especially due to the political framing of our contemporary Holocaust commemoration efforts. Think about the way in which the European Union and member countries have observed International Holocaust Remembrance Day each year. It's according to country. And the category of Sephardi Jews compels us to think differently, to look across national boundaries, not only within. But perhaps more importantly, Sephardi Jews continued to be perceived as distant and exotic, conflated in the popular imagination with Jews of Muslim lands, or non-Ashkenazi Jews, or non-European Jews. They're perceived to lie beyond the reach of the Holocaust, which continues to be conceptualized as a fundamentally European event. And even look at this map, it's from the Holocaust Museum, and notice where it cuts off sort of like in the middle of Greece. And I think that's, it's symbolic, right? There's a symbolic gesture here. And forget about some of the other geographies that I'll be mentioning later on. As Wendy Lauer, the acting director of the Mendel Center here at the Holocaust Museum, observed in her compelling keynote last month on the future of Holocaust research at CUNY, by intent, design, and implementation, the Holocaust was a European event. And she's highlighted how recent scholarship has Europeanized the Holocaust. It's reconceptualized the event not only as one that is centered in Germany, but rather as a much broader continent-wide phenomenon. The expanding geographic boundaries of the event offer unprecedented new perspectives about the scope and the impact of the Holocaust, but I fear that the persistence of, really the insistence on, a European framework actually might hinder our ability to find space for Sephardi Jews and to grasp the full extent of the catastrophe. Is there room in a European narrative for the distinct experiences of the tens of thousands of Jews born in the predominantly Muslim lands of the Ottoman Empire who perished in Auschwitz? Part of the answer I'd like to suggest lies not in Holocaust studies strictly speaking, but rather in the broader parameters according to which we define American and American Jewish history in general, which is through the prism of Europe. The marginal position of Sephardi and other non-Ashkenazi Jews in the Holocaust narrative is matched by their liminal position in American Jewish communal life and in the American historical narrative. So what I'd like to do this evening is to bring together two extra-European geographies, two conceptual margins, the Sephardic experience and American responses, to explore the ways in which Sephardi Jews in the United States confronted the Holocaust. And I would consider my encounter that I described in college also a continuation of that confrontation with the Holocaust, the idea of the Holocaust as we think we know it. I'd like to explore the dynamic through two frameworks and two sets of sources. The first, the activities of Sephardi institutions in the United States as revealed in records of communal organizations in New York and in Greece, and Ladino newspapers, including the vast archives of the Jewish community of Salonica that, in collaboration with the International Archival Acquisitions Program here at the Holocaust Museum, I spent many years tracking down, cataloging, and helping to microfilm and digitize. And the second thing is the efforts of individuals and families as revealed in private correspondence, including materials that I've uncovered through our new Sephardic Studies collection at the University of Washington, which Leah referenced earlier. And I'd like to conclude by returning to this question of where Sephardi Jews fall within our framework of the Holocaust, and if we imagine the Holocaust as a European event. Our story not only ends in the context of war, but we can begin it there too. The Balkan Wars in 1912 and 1913, followed by the Great War, World War I, and then a war between Greece and Turkey in 1919 to 1922, resulted in the violent dissolution of the Ottoman Empire and the emergence of successor nation-states in the Balkans and European colonial regimes in the Middle East that fractured the historic Sephardi Jewish heartlands in that region. Salonica, the city that my own family came from, was really the heart of that heartland. 100 years ago, approximately half of the population of the entire city, what is now and then Greece's second largest city, were Ladino-speaking Sephardic Jews, and it gained such an important reputation that it was designated as the Jerusalem of the Balkans. But as a result of these political and other transformations, as many as a third of the Jews left the region during this period. Those who fled from the rising nation-states of Greece, of Bulgaria, what would become Yugoslavia, did so to escape what they characterized, and you can read about it in the press, it's fascinating, what they characterized as the crusader mentality of the new Christian leaders who directed their animosity against both Muslims and Jews. About 50 to 60,000 of those Jews from the former Ottoman Empire came to the United States between the late 19th century and 1924, and here we see just the sliver of that population that came prior to the start of World War I. They constituted just a tiny fraction of the more than 2.5 million predominantly Yiddish-speaking Eastern European Jews who arrived during the same period, and it's their story that has come to symbolize not only the American Jewish experience, but also in many ways the Holocaust experience. Arriving in the United States, Sephardi Jews encountered a new world that was organized not according to religion or ethno-religious community as it had been in the Ottoman Empire, but something else, a society that was organized according to race. The category of race in the American context referred not only to like what we might consider now like skin color or genealogy, but especially at that time, race was also a cipher, a way to speak about language and religion and geographic origin and social class and economic status and moral standing. In other words, one's suitability for absorption into white American Christian society. Those positioned as more European, more Western, closer to Protestant Christianity, and thus more civilized and more white. Those were the folks who could more easily benefit from the ideals of the American dream. Think about this. From 1790 until 1952, American citizenship was only available to immigrants legally recognized by the state as racially white. or since 1870 if you were of African descent. So if you didn't fit readily into either of these two categories, if you were not immediately recognizable as white or of African descent, whether you were mixed race, Native American, Chinese, Japanese, Indian, like Asian Indian, as well as people from the Ottoman Empire like Syrians and Armenians, they exerted considerable effort to prove their whiteness before the courts of law in this country in order to gain the right to become naturalized. Most actually did not succeed. Although characterized as what one commentator at the time called a racial conundrum, Jews were not barred from citizenship. Within this framework, they were generally considered white, but rather they sought to protect their right to become naturalized. Anti-Semitism was not unknown in this country, and here you can see one of the old anti-Semitic canards of Jews trying to control the world here played out in an American context, where you have Uncle Sam, throwing a Native American, one of the first peoples, off the cliff, and he asserts American. Then you have a guy dressed in a stereotypical, Jewish garment, throwing Uncle Sam off the cliff, as if America is run by Jews. Okay, this is an idea that existed then. We can still hear echoes of it now. So within this framework, when the case of a Christian Syrian came before the court in 1909, is a Syrian white, Jewish leaders panicked because they worried that if Syrians were ruled not white and thus ineligible to become citizens of this country, they wondered, would Jews, who were also perceived at this time to be racially Semitic, racially Middle Eastern, would they lose their right to become citizens? And the concern was that these newly arriving Ottoman Jews, they seemed to offer the link that would connect the European Jew to the Syrian in the American racial imagination. So American Jewish leaders projecting their own anxieties and their own vulnerabilities with regard to anti-Semitism and in a racial and racist environment, what they did was they tried to distance themselves from Ottoman Jews, whom they designated as Orientals, a derisive term that was applied at the time to Asians and to Middle Easterners. And this became a way for them to emphasize the newcomers' allegedly non-European status and to reconfirm their own European bona fides. Now this is well known in American Jewish history. Unfortunately, there was historically a kind of a pecking order insofar as German Jews looked down on Russian Jews, but together they both looked down on Oriental Jews. Here's some Oriental Jews, my family, for you. And sometimes they refused to recognize Ottoman Jews as legitimate Jews, and there are many stories along these lines, where these newcomers, especially men at first, they were forced to prove their Jewishness in a Jewish environment by displaying their prayer shawls or the prayer books, by reciting prayers in Hebrew which they inevitably pronounced in the wrong or in a strange accent, and sometimes they were even forced to reveal their circumcisions. Incredulous Yiddish-speaking Jews on New York's Lower East Side could not fathom that it would be possible in the world for there to be Jews who did not speak Yiddish, let alone people who had names like Al-Hadef or Calvo or Naar, and who came from the Muslim world of the Ottoman Empire. At the National Conference of Jewish Charities convened in 1913, during the Balkan Wars, one attendant remarked, "The Levantine Jew," another name for the Middle Eastern Jew, the Oriental Jew, "is as human or almost as human as any other." So you can see some of this, the internalization of some of this dehumanizing and racialized language. A decade later, in the first academic study of Sephardi Jews in New York, which was conducted by a prominent social scientist who became a dean at Columbia University, so not a nobody, began with the following observation. Sephardi Jews are, quote, nearly as alien to their Ashkenazi kinsmen as are the Negroes to the average white Southerner. He attributed the purported challenges that Ottoman Jews faced in adapting to American society to their alleged inferior racial composition that he viewed as stemming from their backward Ottoman, Oriental, and Muslim atmosphere that he feared they would not be able to slough off. He drew on standard Orientalist, racialized imagery, and he accused them of being lazy, of being disorganized, uneducated, uncultured. In other words, not civilized and not European. Against the backdrop of this kind of alienation, shame, Sephardi Jews in the United States, on their own, developed their own institutions, cafes and mutual aid societies, a vibrant Ladino print culture, Ladino theater. As home to the largest Ladino-speaking community in the world at the time, it's no surprise that Jews from Salonica also formed the most influential contingency in the United States. They established the Salomonic Brotherhood of America in 1915, but within a few years, the organization changed its name to the Sephardic Brotherhood of America and selected the term Sephardic, which refers to Sepharad, the Hebrew term for Spain, as a way to emphasize their Spanish and thus their European identity, in order to distance themselves from the negative associations conjured by terms like Oriental, and especially in the context of World War I, the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, who were adversaries. They hoped that the change in nomenclature would elevate their status in the American racial hierarchy and in the eyes of Ashkenazi Jews. From the beginning, the Sephardic Brotherhood advocated for the Americanization of their members while also remaining connected to their communities of origin. In fact, a request for funds from a Jewish hospital, it was actually a Jewish insane asylum back in Salonica, had served as the impetus for them to organize in the first place, and they subsequently raised funds each year for a wide variety of Jewish philanthropies back home. And they also responded to various crises that arose in Salonica. And here you can see they actually wound up founding a new wing for that Jewish hospital. And you can see here the Jewish Hospital for the Insane of Salonica, and check out toward the bottom, Cuban and American music. So you see, while there was sort of this sense of alienation from the Ashkenazi Jews, with the Latinos, with a different story. There were actually some close bonds that were established there. They also responded to some of these crises. A major fire in 1917, the passage of anti-Jewish legislation in Salonica in 1924, and the first act of anti-Jewish violence in the city in 1931. The slogan was, from which I derived the title of the talk, "Far from us, but close at heart. Lejos de nosotros, ama cerca de corazón." That the Jews from the old world were close at heart. Even though they were far from us, they remained close at heart. And the Ladino newspapers in New York responded to these crises not only with the aim of aiding their native communities, but also, and this is very interesting, they saw these as opportunities to prove to Ashkenazi Jews that they ought to be recognized as a legitimate part of the American Jewish community. In response to the 1931 anti-Jewish attack in Salonica, the infamous Campbell pogrom, the main Ladino newspaper in New York declared, "We hope that the Sephardim in New York will hasten to the aid of our brethren in Salonica to demonstrate to the American Jews that despite our limited resources, we Sephardim are ready to fulfill our duty." Sephardi leaders believed that by showcasing their sense of Jewish solidarity, their ability to gather together resources, they would not only help their native community, but also achieve a greater degree of acceptance from mainstream Jewish institutions. We see similar motivations at play once Hitler rose to power, in the context of the infamous Nazi book burning in 1933. According to Nazi definitions, texts composed by Jews were deemed un-German, Spinoza's books included, Spinoza being a Sephardic Jew. This was of note to the American Sephardi Jewish leaders. And so in response to the planned bonfire, what Time magazine referred to as the Bibliocost, American Jewish organizations initiated one of the largest mass demonstrations ever held on the streets of New York until that time. 100,000 marched in solidarity against the Nazi barbarity. It's interesting, again, the term barbarity. What are they saying? That by burning books, Germans were actually acting not European, not civilized. They were the ones who were acting like barbarians. In this context, the Sephardic Brotherhood of America deemed the participation of the entire Sephardi community essential for two reasons. First, the memory of their own ancestors' persecution at the hands of the Inquisition in Spain compelled them to stand up in protest this time. And they wanted to publicly show their sentiments of solidarity and their commitment to participation in the larger American and American Jewish community. We must demonstrate that the American Sephardim are by no means sleeping, the main Ladino press newspaper declared. We, the Sephardim, constitute one of the branches of the great tree of the American community, and it is our duty to take part in the mass demonstrations. We must join together with our Ashkenazi brethren. 2,000 Sephardi Jews ultimately participated, and in the end, the Ladino press determined that the Sephardi Jews had fulfilled their duty. The common experience of a shared enemy seemed to traverse the divides that had separated Sephardi and Ashkenazi Jews in America. As one article in the Ladino press, actually written in English, indicated, Hitler has taught the Jews the need for common brotherhood. German, Russian, Polish, Spanish, by which they mean Sephardic, and American Jews are all now combined in spirit and deed against their common adversary. But that sense of common brotherhood remained limited. Drawing on their long-standing practice of actively supporting their communities back home, Sephardi Jews in the United States redoubled their efforts with the outbreak of World War II. But in this context, they found greater support and common cause with their Greek Orthodox Christian neighbors. A major meeting of Sephardim for Greek war relief took place in December 1942. Leaders of the Sephardic Brotherhood and other Sephardi organizations gathered with the Greek consul and the Archbishop of the Greek Orthodox Church of America. Speeches were given in English, Ladino, and Greek, and expressions of both Greek and American patriotism denounced the Nazi advance into Eastern and Southeastern Europe. One of the rabbis saw the hand of God at work in the fact that so many of those at the meeting had been sent away from their homes in Greece. He said, we are here in order to save our brothers. The Sephardi Jews in America, the rabbi concluded, ought to feel proud to be in the only country in the world capable of sending aid to their suffering brethren. But the possibilities of granting overseas assistance remained unclear. Little information was available during the wartime, and there was very limited reportage about what was going on in this corner of Europe. A Ladino journalist captured the sense of anxiety. Will we be prepared? He asked his readers. How will we respond to the cry for help? Those above two questions have preoccupied me to such an extent that frequently in the middle of the night I get up to smoke a cigarette and smoke yet another one, to think and think some more about what our response will be when we are confronted by the call of distress, bitter cries of agony, cries of suffering that inevitably we await to receive one day or another from our brothers across the Balkans, and particularly our brothers in Salonica. And once they did receive the news, they went to work, sending aid as best they could. And they did so also in cooperation with Greek aid channels. As you can see here, an advertisement for the Greek War Relief Association, principally written in Ladino in the Ladino press. I'd now like to turn to a different set of sources. Private correspondence among family members who were divided across the ocean as well, but a slightly different geography, and to focus on the island of Rhodes. These correspondence reveal a different preoccupation among Sephardi Jews in the United States. In this correspondence, the emphasis is not on seeking to gain recognition from their Ashkenazi Jewish neighbors, but rather seeking economic security and perhaps more pressingly, to try to secure visas for relatives who remained behind. Most visa efforts were thwarted during this time period due to U.S. immigration laws, most notably the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act, which severely curtailed immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, with very few spots available for Greece and Turkey, and virtually none from Asia. And here you can see some of the nativist rhetoric, riffraff immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe who were perceived to be danger to American ideas and institutions, including a threat to the purported whiteness of America. Here you can see the quota regulations. So you can see, okay, England, there were quite a number of spots available, but if we go down, Greece, only 307 spots. Turkey 226, Syria and Lebanon, which was a French mandate at the time, only 123, and British Palestine 100. So that, I mean, very, very, very limited numbers, especially for those countries. It's also interesting to note that although there was no quota set for Jews specifically, because there was no Jewish country at the time, Jews were among the primary targets for exclusion, as was made clear by the architect of the Johnson-Reed Act, Senator Albert Johnson himself, who represented Washington State, where I currently live, and he endorsed the belief that Jews are filthy, un-American, and often dangerous in their habits, and he saw Jews as the primary people he wanted to not enter into this country. Immigration restriction he saw to be the only way to halt the stream of alien blood which he perceived to be polluting the true Nordic stock of America. An ardent eugenicist, an advocate of race science, Johnson found some of his greatest support in the Ku Klux Klan. But they were not a marginal group. His views, endorsed by the Klan, were mainstream at the time and basically endorsed and adopted by Congress. And that's how we get to like the infamous case of the SS St. Louis in the late 30s, a group of 800 or so Jewish refugees who come on a ship and are turned back. Now, what's interesting about these immigration restriction acts was that they were not only discussed in the American public, but as legal historian James Whitman has suggested in his recent book, Hitler's American Model, the 1924 Immigration Restriction Act served as inspiration for Hitler. He saw in the Immigration Restriction Act evidence that the United States, by excluding all of these racially inferior groups, especially Jews, that the United States, therefore, was embracing the supremacy of the Aryan race and more closely followed Nazi ideology than any other country on the face of the earth. And you can see the impact of the immigration restriction on Jewish migration during this period. So there were some earlier quotas that were established in 1921 that attributes to the initial drop-off, but you see after 1924. Now, I began to review some files at the National Archives here in Washington, D.C., trying to trace the experiences of Jewish immigrants from the Ottoman Empire, from Greece and Turkey. And it's interesting to note how U.S. immigration officials referred to these immigrants, oftentimes calling them Turks of the Hebrew race. And there were dramatic effects of immigration laws on their experiences as well. One of the first files that I encountered was for a young woman named Rebecca Alaluf, who could not pass a newly instituted literacy exam that came about in 1917. This was one of the moves up to the 1924 Act that tried to prevent undesirables from entering this country. Alaluf was slated for deportation, but she appealed, and that's why her file found its way to Washington, D.C. And as I was reading the testimony, I froze. Her brother-in-law was my great-uncle's father, and he came to testify on her behalf. It didn't help. That great-uncle of mine also solicited a letter, and here you can see that she's been scheduled for deportation, and she's entitled to appeal. Now what happens is that this great-uncle of mine winds up getting a letter from a New York state representative, a congressman, Henry Goldfogel, who vouches for Alaluf and the family and says that the relatives in America will take care of the family, that they are upstanding citizens. One of my great-uncle's brothers had served in the U.S. Army during World War I, et cetera, et cetera. And what's interesting is you would think maybe such a letter would do something, but immigration authorities were unmoved by the appeal, and they upheld the ruling and deported Alaluf to Greece, even though her family was actually originally from Izmir in Turkey, but at the time, Greece occupied the eastern part of Asia Minor, so she was sent to Greece. I have no idea what happened to her, and there is no one left who can tell me, but we can infer how her story may have ended. And here again, I would suggest that her liminal status as not quite European, Turkish, Jewish, a Turk of the Hebrew race, likely impacted her fate. I'd like to focus on a set of correspondence now. A set of correspondence that has surfaced as a result of the project to collect documentation about Sephardic Jews in Ladino that I have begun in Seattle. And I'd like to tell you the story of 9-year-old Clara Barkey. It's pictured here, living on the island of Rhodes, and at that time, at age 9, she initiated a correspondence in Ladino with her uncle, Rafael Capeludo, who was then living in Seattle, an uncle who had left for the United States before she was even born. She didn't know him personally. The letters pose an interesting methodological challenge because we only have the letters that were sent from Rhodes and received in Seattle. The return messages we do not have. Now, a little on Rhodes. Part of the Ottoman Empire since the 16th century and situated just 11 miles off the coast of mainland Turkey, Rhodes had been home to a small but important Jewish community, and in 1912, the same year that Salonica becomes part of Greece, Rhodes is incorporated into the Italian Empire. After Mussolini's rise to power, Jews in Rhodes were forced to embrace fascism, but it was a very interesting dynamic because the fascist state, trying to curry the favor of the Jews, actually founded and funded a new rabbinical seminary on the island of Rhodes. Very unusual in the annals of 20th century history. It became a very famous place and attracted rabbinical students from all across the Mediterranean, including from Salonica. Now, while we know about Anne Frank and her diary, we have very few accounts by Sephardi Jewish girls or young women describing their experiences amid the rise of fascism and the onset of World War II. Although not a diary and not composed in hiding, Clara Barkey's letters offer a personal glimpse into a young woman's world on the cusp of unimaginable rupture and impending doom. She writes her missives and concludes many of them with her trademark expression, a hug from afar. In her poignant letters, Clara describes life on Rhodes, attending school, helping siblings with homework, going to the cinema, including on Shabbat, learning how to make dresses, celebrating the Jewish holidays, a failed effort to send a jar of homemade apricot paste to America, bouts of meningitis, grieving the deaths of elders, difficulties accumulating in a dowry to marry off an aunt, expressions of gratitude upon receiving remittances from Seattle, and joy and consolation upon the receipt of a cherished letter, and deep worry and anxiety when no letters arrive for months at a time. I mean, obviously no internet, no texting, so this was a very serious kind of enterprise. The tenor of the letters changed in 1933. They increasingly begin to focus on the desire for the Rhodes family to come to the United States. At first, Clara urges her Seattle uncle to help ascertain a visa for her unmarried aunt in the hopes that in America she'll be able to find a better life for herself. But subsequent letters describe how the Depression was negatively impacting life on Rhodes, the economy, how the children no longer had presentable clothing, how the family began to pawn their valuables to make ends meet, and how Jewish youth, Jewish men, began leaving for Egypt, the Belgian Congo, and elsewhere, places that would accept them in search of work and in order to avoid being drafted into the Italian army. 1938 marked a major turning point. That year, Mussolini promulgated the Race Manifesto, an echo of the Nuremberg laws. The manifesto stated that biological races in fact exist. The Aryans are Italians, and thus they are superior to others, Jews being the prime example of those deemed inferior. Intermarriage between Jews and Aryans was banned. Jews were excluded from the military, government, offices, banks, liberal professions. This is a familiar story. Public schools. They could not stay at holiday resorts or operate radios or publish newspapers. Limits were set on property ownership and earnings. But from Clara's vantage point, the issue of greatest concern was a law that forced all residents of Rhodes who had arrived on the island since 1919, that law forced them all to leave. And among those marked for expulsion was Clara's father, Avraham Barkey, who had been born in Aydin in Turkey, from which he had fled in order to escape military conscription. Since Barkey fled without proper Turkish documentation, Turkey would not permit him to return. That decision was part of a broader Turkish government policy of Turkification that sought to reduce the non-Muslim, non-Turkish speaking populations in the country, in part by preventing Turkish Jews, Armenians, Greeks living abroad from returning. Hitler even expressed admiration for the intensity of Turkish nationalism at the time. Since the Barkey family could not return to Turkey, Clara laments, "It is with tears in my eyes that I'm writing this letter, only to tell you that we were born to suffer. This only happens to the Jews who have the bad luck of not having a country where we could seek refuge in time of distress." Get a sense maybe of her political leanings there. "They can do nothing to the Greeks and Turks because they have governments to protect them. I cannot continue writing because every time I think about the situation, I start crying, especially of the thought of how they are debasing us in the newspapers. They call us crooks and troublemakers, and there is no end to what they are doing, and we cannot say anything. They say they will send us to hell. Please, dear uncle, I beg you to answer and give me a ray of hope, if only as a mitzvah, as a good deed, as a commandment. For we find ourselves at an impasse. If we do not try to make arrangements in time, I can foresee the end." The situation becomes ever more tenuous in the wake of Kristallnacht in November of 1938. Clara writes, "I do not know what sin we have committed to find ourselves in these circumstances. Heaven will decide our fate and will determine where we wind up, except, dear uncle, if you take pity on us and show us a way of escape. I throw myself at your feet, dear uncle, and beg you to do your utmost to save us. Imagine that what may happen to us has already happened to our ancestors in Spain. In our despair, the only help that we can expect is from you. We rack our brains to find ways to escape. We see no one but you. I repeat, we have no one." They're punishing not only us, but also those who will remain on roads. No more circumcision for baby boys. No more kosher slaughtering of meat. No more synagogues. Everything is becoming dark for the Jews of Rhodes. Do not let us die. For if we do not leave, they will condemn us to prison and will treat us like stray dogs. Fervent correspondence ensued. Uncle Raphael in Seattle prepared the documentation to show that he and other relatives would be willing to serve as guarantors for the Rhodes family, but the U.S. Consular Corps gives Clara the runaround. The American consulates in Naples, Athens, and Izmir keep passing the family's case back and forth. Who will have jurisdiction over a formerly Turkish citizen that Turkey does not recognize who has children who are citizens of the Italian Empire? Clara initially suspects that the consul, especially the one in Naples who they were dealing with first, is a bad fellow. And she takes his decision-making and unwillingness to help them, she takes it personally. But soon she realizes that the issue is bigger. She was very astute. She recognized that there is a problem in American policy here. By December of 1938, Clara concludes that the American consular officials refused to visa the family because, quote, they do not want to sign any papers for those born in Turkey. Remember, the Turkish quota was 226. By May 1938, Clara is at wit's end. She laments that their fate is in God's hands, that unless something drastic changes, they will be dragged to the Rhodes concentration camp, she uses this term, which is like a prison. In the final plea, Clara writes, prophetically, not knowingly, I beg you to come to our aid, to save us from the fire that awaits us. At the last moment, Clara receives word that Tangier, a free port in Morocco, will accept the family as refugees. And it is there, in the refugee camp, where the family survives the war years, from 1939 to 1946, in dismal circumstances. Clara persists in seeking to secure U.S. visas for her family during this time, 7 years, and she continues to confront the problem of immigration restriction. The American consul, she writes, told us that it is very difficult for us, advising us that the Turkish quota had already been filled long ago, and is more difficult for those than from for us than for those from other countries, and she receives this kind of reply for 7 years. The Turkish quota has already been filled. Even when she writes at the very beginning of the year, she's perplexed by this. But only in 1946, after the end of the war, once the Seattle extended family raised considerable funds, they supplied numerous letters of support. They gained the backing of a Washington state member of the House of Representatives. They traveled to Washington, D.C. to testify on behalf of their relatives in Tangier. Only then did the U.S. government grant the much-coveted visas. They were able to settle in Seattle with their relatives in 1946, with the exception of the father, that former stateless Turkish citizen who was not permitted to enter the country for 3 more years in 1949, and he was counted against the Turkish quota. In the meantime, oh, here you see them. It's fascinating. This was in the Seattle Times. The sanitized presentation here I find very remarkable. They're traveling. I mean, they were traveling. I mean, group from Rhodes happy in 7 languages. So they can't quite come to terms with the reality of what they faced in the popular imagination. Maybe it's unclear whether they were not willing to share the story or whether American popular imagination was ready to receive the story. Now, in the meantime, Jews in Salonica and Rhodes, they'd already been murdered. In Salonica, the chronology was compressed. Jewish men were conscripted for forced labor in the summer of 1942. Here you can see them being registered in the ironically named Liberty Square in the center of Salonica. In the winter, the local Greek Christian authorities, the university, the municipality, and the Chamber of Commerce orchestrated the destruction and expropriation of the city's vast Jewish cemetery, the largest cemetery in all of Europe, that stretched over the space of 86 football fields and housed 350,000 graves. And in 1943, the Nuremberg laws were introduced, and the following week, very fast, ghettoization began. A few weeks later, in March, and continuing into August, nearly 50,000 Jews were deported from Salonica to Auschwitz-Birkenau. As I learned from my own family letters in Ladino, one of the sources that really sparked my interest in studying this history, my great-uncle, Tio Salomon, and his family begged the relatives already in the United States to secure visas for them. But again, due to immigration restriction, they did not succeed. 1938, one of the letters, veramente, you can follow along here, veramente, yamos metió a todas las ideas, y no se sabe cuál hacer, siendo le hago saber que en vuestra mano no hay nada, siempre es en vosotros. And in 1940, deseamos de todo corazón de nos topamos a vuestro lado por tener la alegría cumplida. They did not succeed in gaining those visas. A reminder of how exceptional the case of the Barkey family from Rhodes was. Tio Salomon was charged by the Jewish community with distributing milk and yogurt to the sick and elderly as they boarded the trains from the ghetto of Salonica. For this reason, he and his wife Esther and their children, Benjamin and Rachel, were among the last Jews remaining in the city. They all perished in Auschwitz-Birkenau. Only 1,200 of the 50,000 Jews of Salonica survived. 8 times more Jews from Salonica perished than in all of Italy. In Rhodes, the decision by Mussolini to expel foreigners like the Barkey family wound up sparing their lives. They could have never guessed, of course. Deportations only began after Mussolini fell in 1943 and continued into 1944. The Jews from Rhodes were sent in July of 1944. July 1944, very late in the war. They were sent by ship to Piraeus, the port of Athens, and from there by train to Salonica and northward to Central Europe, to Poland. The 1700 Jews of Rhodes had the dubious distinction of traveling the furthest to meet their deaths at Auschwitz. It took them 23 days to get there. Only 150 survived. While still in Tangier, Clara Barkey learned of the deaths of most of her extended family. Uncle Raphael's parents, for example. And she reported the news to the Seattle relatives. The young men of Rhodes experienced hell, a hell conceived of by Dante and put into effect by wicked Hitler. Today, there are less than 1,000 Jews in Salonica and only a couple dozen in Rhodes. I'd like to conclude by reflecting on the three themes that I tried to touch on tonight. The contours of the Holocaust narrative, the effects of Sephardi Jews in America, both to gain acceptance and also to gain acceptance by their Ashkenazi Jewish neighbors and by American society more generally, and the challenges they faced trying to bring their relatives to America. They're all linked, I would suggest, in different ways, but still there is a link. A preoccupation with Europeanness, an identity that was not only about geography, but also explicitly or implicitly tied to ideas about race, about civilization and barbarism. The same liminal Europeanness that led to the marginalization or exclusion of Sephardi Jews from general American European Jewish community life, and also limited their eligibility for entry into the United States as Turks of the Hebrew race. This also explains, I'd like to suggest, at least to a certain extent, their general invisibility in our Holocaust narrative. We must accept that the lingering residue of the long-established mode of thinking, that privileges Europe does so not only due to geography, but also to deeper unconscious assumptions that we make about identity, politics, race, and human worth, about whose stories are worthy to be told and whose stories are worthy of being heard. These dynamics that I suggest have also contributed to the erasure of the Sephardi experience. As much as the state of the field of Holocaust studies has progressed, from thinking about a German-centered narrative of the Holocaust to thinking about a European-wide phenomenon, I think we need to go further. We must not only think about Europe, but also to think about the reach of Europe's empire. It was not only Nazi Germany that established an empire across the continent into Eastern and Southeastern Europe, but it was also within the framework of British, French, and Italian colonial contexts in which Jews confronted the final solution, or at least elements of it. By reference to European empire, now we may very readily expand the boundaries of our story, and we can secure a place for Rhodes as a former Ottoman island that became part of the Italian empire. We may even think about Greece similarly as a formerly Ottoman territory granted independence only under, initially at least, the tutelage of the great powers, who appointed German and Danish royal families to rule over what were perceived to be a not quite civilized enough people. And we may also include Turkey, which emerged as an independent state after World War I, only after liberating Anatolia from the French and British occupation forces, while relinquishing the territories of the Middle East to the subjugation of the British and French. And furthermore, if you go back to the infamous Wannsee Protocol of 1942, which outlined the Jewish communities targeted for the final solution, the Nazis included the Jews of Turkey on that list. Is Turkey in Europe? Is it out of Europe? It is also through the prism of European empire that we can center other marginal, yet no less significant experiences in North Africa, which is the subject of a forthcoming book by Sarah Abrevaya-Stein and Omar Baum, and the culmination of a collaboration with actually Leah Wolfson and other scholars here that will help us better understand the fate of Jews in Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, some of whom wound up in the camps of Europe. Over 40,000 Jews from Morocco have received reparations from the Claims Conference, but they are not part of our narrative. What about the story of the Mufti of Jerusalem? What about the story of the Farhud, the violent anti-Jewish pogrom in 1941 in Iraq, spurred by pro-Hitler propaganda? The reality is that I'd like to suggest we ought to consider the Holocaust not only as a European event, not even only a European event that stretches into European colonial contexts, but also to consider it within limits, at least, a global event with worldwide ramifications. Only by reference to a global lens may we explain the stories I've shared today, the ways in which Sephardi Jews in the United States responded to the plight of their brethren, the role of U.S. immigration laws in shaping the fate of those relatives, the status of Turkish citizens, the refugee camp in Tangier, and much more. As much as we have shaken off some of the categories of the first half of the 20th century, racially laden categories, we have not fully liberated ourselves from our Eurocentrism. Do we believe that Europe represents civilization, and those who reside beyond its borders don't really count? That their voices don't deserve to be heard? Centering the once marginal voices of Sephardi Jews, I think, challenges us to confront that question head on, to develop a framework that can be capacious enough to honor their memories, and to recognize what really were the global horrors of the Holocaust. Thank you.
Thank you, Devin, for a very thought-provoking and rich lecture this evening. I would now like to open up the floor for questions. There's a microphone on each aisle. I'm going to ask and perhaps require that the questions stay brief so that we can entertain as many as we possibly can. Please.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Galanti. I was born and raised in the Sephardic community in Atlanta. It's interesting to hear you speak about efforts by family members in the United States to help their relatives who are still in Europe or extended Europe. But what about during the Holocaust? What did they know of what was going on? I know my relatives in Rhodes, they were not affected until 1944, like you said. Was there the sense that they were sort of exempt from the horrors that they were reading about in U.S. newspapers in continental Europe? What was the knowledge there like?
It's a great question. I think that Rhodes and like mainland Greece are different stories, because in Rhodes, because of Mussolini, because it being an Italian colony, because of the introduction of the race laws in 1938, there was a bit more of a panic. And we saw those in Clara's letters. And you can see in different parts of the country, I don't know about Atlanta, but I would be interested in looking into it. In Seattle, there were fundraisers and there were banquets where people would come together to raise funds to send overseas to try to aid their relatives, to try to get them visas, to come out, to get out of Rhodes. So they were aware of those circumstances, and like you could see here, at least in some instances, families were continuing to receive and send correspondence at least until 1939 or so. But really, from 1941, 42, 43, I mean, very little is known. Very little information is coming in, and it creates a big challenge. The case of Greece and Salonica is a little bit different. There, Greece was an independent, country, and they couldn't imagine any of the things that they were reading about what was happening to Jews in Germany, in Austria, in Eastern Europe. There was one a well-known writer from Salonica who writes in 1940. He says he's really perplexed and also amazed. He says that Jewish history in general is a valley of tears. It's a history of suffering, and we're seeing another one of these valleys right now all across Europe, where there's crying and suffering, but not in Greece, where he sees Greece is an oasis of hope. You know, as Jews are being kicked out of the public school system in Rhodes or in Germany, in Poland, actually Jews are being integrated at rapid rates into the public school system in Salonica and other parts of Greece. They're learning Greek at a much greater rate than ever before. So there was great surprise and shock. You know, this is something that Hitler will never come here. This is far away. This is far away. And so I think that made people really incredulous. I mean, they couldn't believe the reports that they heard. Are they real? And you would find all sorts of misinformation circulating in the press. I remember in 1943, there was an article that circulated in the New York newspapers that said 25,000 Jews from Salonica were hidden in the nearby town of Volos. Okay, it was just like completely made up, but you know, people couldn't really tell what to make of the scenario, especially until it became clear what had happened. Like the New York Times, only in late 1944, publishes a tiny little article which is really about the beginnings of the Greek Civil War, but it says, oh, and by the way, all the Jews of Salonica are feared, pardon me, I don't remember the exact word, liquidated, eliminated, something like that. So they didn't really know. Thank you.
What is the situation today of Jewish communities in Turkey and in Greece, and what's the outlook for them?
You mean today?
Today.
Today. It's a little out of my range of expertise in terms of the contemporary scene, but I mean, I think what I would say there are diverging situations. I think in Greece, there is a competing kind of interest at play. On the one hand, you have the rise of the far right, like the Golden Dawn Party, which brings with it xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and other forms of racism and intolerance. And that has very dramatic and negative impact on the Jews in Greece. At the same time, in a place like Salonica, there is a mayor who is in office who has been promoting, really the first leader in that city since the war, who has actively and publicly sought to reclaim both the Jewish and to a certain extent the Muslim past in the city, is willing to speak about it, is willing to honor it, is willing to promote tourism, heritage tourism, to favor those groups. And as a result, he was actually beat up by some right-wing provocateurs a couple of weeks ago. So that's Greece on the one hand. Turkey is a slightly different dynamic. You know, Turkey, since even Ataturk, the way that the Jewish community operated itself, the slogan, one of the slogans was Kaya Dez, silence. You know, don't make waves, and you'll be protected. And you can see in the current administration, the sort of this neo-Ottomanism and this kind of attempt to pinch out minority groups has left Jews among other populations in a kind of precarious situation. And you can see this revealed in the way in which Jews in Greece have been quite actively pursuing the Spanish government's offer to provide Spanish nationality to the descendants of the Jews expelled from Spain in 1492. And so I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but there have been hundreds of Jews from Turkey who have been applying for Spanish nationality, for Spanish citizenship, not only so that they can have a passport for the EU for business purposes, but actually in case and maybe if they want to leave.
Good evening. Thank you for your lecture. My question is, so you suggested that this denial of non-European, specifically Sephardic Jews in America, was due in large part to racial discrimination in the U.S., and I was wondering if you have found that similar denial or discrimination occurred or still occurs in Europe currently, and also if there was, during the war, communication between Sephardic Jews and European Jews.
It's a great question. I mean, the racism didn't go away by any stretch of any imagination anywhere. The way to answer the question would be to say that I think some of the same problems that I was describing have taken a different kind of form per se, and maybe the kind of rhetoric is not as intense or not as overt, but it still exists in the way in which structures of oppression continue to shape the way in which the opportunities and the absence of opportunities for people of color in the United States and in Europe. And I think that's very clear. In terms of the encounter of European and Sephardi Jews, or Sephardi and Ashkenazi Jews, in the context of the Holocaust, this was also a precarious encounter. You have many accounts of Ladino-speaking Jews finding their way to Auschwitz, having their Jewishness denied by Ashkenazi Jews for the same reasons that I described. Say, how could you be Jewish when you don't speak Yiddish? Or how could you be Jewish when you look like this or when you speak like that? Perhaps the most infamous of these encounters takes place actually in one of the displaced person camps in Germany at Feldafing in 1948, where there were several hundred survivors from Auschwitz. And there was a kind of a dispute between a Polish Jew and a Greek Jew. These are the categories used in the documentation. The Polish Jew said he won't buy the shoes that the Greek guy is selling because, he says something to the effect of, because as everybody knows, the Greeks are crooks and they're backwards and I can't be caught doing business with them. They get into a physical altercation, and a Jew from Salonica and a Jew from Corfu is passing by, and they see the altercation. They get in and they start beating up the Polish Jew, who's taken to the hospital, but a rumor spreads that the Greeks killed him. Okay? The Polish Jew, the Polish Jew's brother, gets together a band of his friends and compatriots, and they go and they sack the huts of the Greek Jews. They set them on fire, they break the windows, they stab some of the leaders of the Jewish community, and there's like a riot. It's referred to as a pogrom in the records, and that's, I think, the most extreme. There's only one instance of this, but I think just to show the extreme, the lengths in which some of these categories of thinking could be deployed even in an intra-Jewish environment.
Thank you.
Hi, Marcia.
Devin, as always, thank you. You make me think. What I'm thinking of is, why do we get the narratives coming out now, which thank God they are, from certain communities in Greece, such as Salonica and Rhodes, and why is there a void still in narratives coming from other communities, such as Yanina or Kavala, which actually had larger populations than the island of Rhodes? What are the dynamics behind that, and how can we change it?
It's a fascinating question about the differing sort of dynamics at play in differing Greek environments. I think the Salonica answer is a little bit easier because it is the second biggest city in Greece, and it did have the largest Jewish community in the country. So I think there is some sort of gravitas associated with that case. I think heritage tourism is part of the answer here. Rhodes being a major tourist destination in the way that some of these other places are not, like Kavala, Yanina. They do have tourism, but I think that is a slightly different dynamic. And I think what is different again about Rhodes from the other mainland cases that you referred to was the extent to which there was a very vast Rhodesli diaspora in a way that there was not for Kavala or for Yanina. Really a plurality of Jews from Rhodes left before the war because they saw the signs in a way that were not visible in the late Ottoman period or in interwar Greece. And so I think you can see the way in which Rhodes Jews from Atlanta to Seattle to different parts in the southern part of Africa to Brussels and other places, there are still these Rhodesli communities that are active and thinking of themselves or reimagining themselves in more recent generations as connected to the island. Those are just some of my initial thoughts. How do you get greater visibility for some of these other communities is, I think, to do what you've been doing. To try to make those stories known about Yanina, to bring out the Greek-Jewish story. And that, I mean, I am guilty of that erasure tonight. You know, like for everything that we say, other things go in the footnote or get left out. Like I did not at all speak about Romaniot Jews, about the Greek-speaking Jews who lived in what is now Greece for, you know, several thousands of years.
You did have Joe Joseph's letter.
That's true, that's true. So there was an
Thank
implicit,
you.
I didn't speak about them, they were present,
Right.
like that Greek, if we go back to this
I want
document.
a copy of that, Devin, please.
If we go back to, if you permit me, pardon me, where was it?
Right
Here,
before, yeah.
if you go back to this is a fascinating document, and if I had more time, I would have elaborated on it, but the Greek American Jews of New York for the Greek War Relief. Okay, not the most snappy title of an organization, but they have 32 board members. The first 16 are all Yaniotes, okay? So half of them are Yaniotes, the other section are Salonicans, and then Castoriales. So in this enterprise, when it came to organizing in a Greek environment, the Yaniotes led the way.
Yes, thank you again.
We're short on time. I'm going to go over here for our last question.
So as a historian that spends so much time reflecting on these themes of immigration and discrimination and so forth, do you have any reflections that you'd like to share with us about your the current American conversation about immigration and how some of these themes that you're studying are echoed in today's conversation and how we're informed?
Yeah, I mean, I have plenty of things to say. I mean, I'll give you this story. My great uncle, I knew him as Uncle Bob, okay? His name was Raphael. He was born in the Ottoman Empire in Salonica, and he was the only person I knew growing up born in the 19th century. He wanted to come to the United States, but he couldn't get a visa. And he didn't want to go into the Greek military. So he stowed away to Istanbul, where he picked up false documentation that said, it's unclear, we don't have those documents, it's unclear what it was, but he got papers on the street. That's what it said in the one recording we have of him telling the story. He went to Cuba, and from Cuba he went to Mexico. And in 1920, again, he couldn't get a visa. He didn't have papers. He literally did not have, he had papers. He didn't have papers that were actually for him. And 1925, 1 year after the immigration law comes into effect, 1924, he crosses into the United States under the name Roberto Farias Jr. Made up the name. He said junior, to emphasize, like, I'm not Jewish. I'm a junior. But what's fascinating in the document, I have his, where he had to pay a head tax. He says, what does it say? Roberto Farias Jr., place of birth, Mexico City. Nationality, Mexican. Race, Mexican. Now think about that. A world in which it was easier to enter the United States as a Mexican than as a Jew, Greek, or a Turk. When he applied for citizenship in 1932, things had changed a little bit. And this was in a moment in which there were mass deportations of Mexicans taking place. About 500,000 Mexicans were deported in the 1930s back to Mexico, including American-born, American citizen children of Mexicans. So when Uncle Bob, Roberto Farias Jr., applies for American citizenship, I mean, he has to continue the ploy. He changes one interesting category, which is he still says, yes, he's born in Mexico, but he says race, Hebrew. Because at this point, which by the way, until the 1940s, Jews were identified in the United States as Hebrews by race. It was not, the US government did not recognize, it was not a religious category, it was a racial category. So if you look at your family's immigration files, you may see in the Ellis Island registry or your naturalization papers, under race it will say Hebrew. they are Jews. So he recognized that actually in 1932, it's better to be Jewish than Mexican. And in 1937, I did a Freedom of Information request to get his application for Social Security, Roberto Farais Jr., okay? And there it says also, it doesn't say his race there, but it says former nationality, Mexican. Place of birth, he made it up, Chilpancingo, Mexico, okay? So, in other words, he lived the life in which, from the perspective of the government, he was Mexican. He also got his first job at the Michelin Tire Company, which was a French company. And this company officially, unofficially didn't hire Jews. Uncle Bob had a French education in Salonica. He went to the Alliance Israélite Universelle, and as he passed as a Mexican at the border, he passed as a Frenchman at work. And he was also the Chazan, the cantor of the Sephardic synagogue in New Jersey. So on Shabbat, he was a super Sephardic Jew. And it was from him who I learned, for my bar mitzvah. What is this all to say? What happened to Uncle Bob's family that stayed behind? What happened to my relatives who stayed behind? I mean, they all died in Auschwitz. So, in some ways, I guess I'm proud of Uncle Bob for gaming an unjust system. That's what he did, and he lived because of it.
Well, I would just add, I had 40 relatives who were lost at Auschwitz, and when you talk about really undesirable families that came to America, I would give you my family.
Sure.
My grandmother from Salonica was illiterate, and her son my uncle got a PhD in electrical engineering at MIT, and my brother invented Embrel in Factor 8, And I just wonder how we could be, my story isn't unique. I'm just one of all of us. I'm just wondering how we could have forgotten that we're all immigrants, and some of us just, as one scholar puts it, just arrived on an earlier boat. So anyway, your remarks today really reverberate the story of my family, so I really appreciate your talk tonight.
Many thanks to Dr. Naar for his impressive lecture. Many thanks to the Weinmann-Shorenstein family, as always, for their generosity, and to Janice for her words. And I invite you all to join us in the Hall of Witness for a reception. Thank you very much.